Hey everyone, it's Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap expert, and I'm going to talk about the De'Anthony Melton for Dennis Schroder trade. Already one of the most active December 15th in a while. We have this trade and the Thomas Bryant trade, two trades that were agreed upon before we even get to December 15th. Reminds me kind of Trevor Ariza for Kelly Oubre back in 2018. That was one of like the bigger ways to start trade season. So I'm going to get into the trade. Before I get into anything, just please subscribe if you haven't already. It'll help the channel a lot. And I also just launched my Substack, The Third Apron, where I get even deeper into salary cap analysis. The link is in the description. So earlier this week, I spoke about the Jimmy Butler trade rumors, and I got into how the Warriors can get involved. And the biggest factor with them with any type of trade is their proximity to the first apron, that $178.1 million amount they cannot exceed it at any point this season. So any trade they do, basically the money needs to be identical, what they're sending out, what they're bringing in, or they got to be decreasing payroll for the most part. So I plugged in Dennis Schroder for De'Anthony Melton. He only makes about $200,000 more than Melton, and now they are roughly $330,000 below the first apron. So the trade works. It's an easy swap. The Warriors can do it. But I guess the next question is, how does this impact their pursuit of an all-star player like potentially Jimmy Butler? And the other question to that extent would be, can they get a deal done without using Dennis Schroder, because he is their fourth highest paid player? And assuming that they want to keep Draymond Green, you're sending out Wiggins, and you got to basically match Jimmy Butler's $49 million salary. How are you going to make the money work, but then also be able to fill out the rest of the roster? You got to be able to get back to 14 players without exceeding that first apron. So here's how we could work on the Warriors end, and it's very similar to what I wrote about the Mavericks and how they could potentially make a deal done for Jimmy Butler. It would be an imbalanced trade. They're sending out more players than they're bringing in. But if they want to keep Dennis Schroder, who again, they just gave up 2 second-round picks for, maybe they want to see it through, then they can get it done with Andrew Wiggins, Gary Payton, Kevon Looney, and Jonathan Kuminga, who is probably makes his inclusion alone makes the Warriors one of the more realistic destinations for Jimmy Butler. So I plugged in Jimmy. He gave him his trade bonus too, which puts him at the max salary. As I mentioned in my Butler video earlier this week, that if he waives his trade bonus, he can't extend for the rest of the season. So would make some sense for the Warriors to keep him extension eligible just to see if there is something they could agree to. So I've got Jimmy in and those 3 players out, and I've got them filling out the rest of the roster on trade deadline day with veteran minimum salaries. Now, if they were to do this on trade deadline day, they don't necessarily need to get back to 14 players on that day, but I am just putting the amount that those players would be owed, just to show that it works in the end. They stay below the first apron, and they would still have moves, still have enough flexibility to make some other moves later. I should mention, just because it is possible to make this work on the Warriors end, there's still other complications that need to be sorted out, mainly that a third or fourth team is probably going to need to get involved, because I don't think the Heat are going to want to take all 4 of these players back just for Jimmy Butler. It's going to be complicated. They might have to cut some players. They want to save money if they're trading Jimmy Butler, because in all likelihood, they're getting worse as well. So it would make sense for them to try to get another team involved to take back some of these salaries that the Heat probably don't want to take. But in that case, the Warriors probably got to give up a little something else. And they don't really have any second round picks left. They have about 2 left after this trade. So for the Warriors, you really want to exhaust all your remaining marginal assets just to facilitate this huge deal. And just in terms of what the Warriors gave up, giving up a net of 2 second-round picks for a player like Dennis Schroder is pretty damn good value. He's been having arguably the best season of his career so far, and he's been a huge reason that the Nets had the surprising start that they had, especially in November. And he's shown in the past, especially in his second stint with the Lakers, that he could play off ball with another guard. So maybe he could fit well next to Steph Curry. Shams Charania was saying about an hour ago that they actually envision being able to play them together a lot and even start them together. My only thing to be worried about is, let's just see how well he could fit into Steve Kerr's system. Steve Kerr's system, it's definitely arguably one of the most complex in the league, and it's very hard for a lot of players to fit in. There's been a lot of good players that have cycled through in the past, and it just doesn't work, but then they do a lot better elsewhere. So they've got about less than 2 months to see if this works. They can still aggregate Dennis Schroder's salary in another trade for potentially a Jimmy Butler type if they need to. So if it doesn't work quite as well as they hope, they still have that option later. I thank Nets Daily for doing the count because I just don't have it in me right now. But this is what it's all about. The Nets, they already have 15 first round picks, a couple pick swaps, and now their second round pick count is at 13. So the Nets just continuing to add on to that pile. And yeah, come to think of it, when I think about who has the most raw first round picks or just draft picks in total, it's probably between them and OKC. If they're not number one, they're probably a pretty close number two to OKC now. So here's the Nets payroll after the trade. Pretty simple swap. Both teams had their own specific financial restrictions. For the Nets, they were already pretty close to the luxury tax line. They were 2.1 million below it, so they gained a little bit more flexibility. And so since this was a two-team trade, it just made a lot of sense for both these teams that they keep the money as identical as possible so they can stay within whatever limitations that they were working with. So a couple other things that the Nets could create a $13 million trade exception for Schroder, which would be good for 1 year. They would be able to trade for a player, absorb a player in a trade, making up to that amount. The big trade-off is that if they do that, they would take Melton into their non-taxpayer mid-level exception in order to do it, in which case they no longer have it. And they might not need it just because they're probably not going to sign any veterans with it this year, but if just in case they want to sign any young players or convert some of their two-way players to 3 or 4 year deals, then that's where it could come in handy. So it'll be interesting to see if the Nets decide to go that route. So Melton's out for the year. He has that torn ACL. The Warriors could have applied for a disabled player exception, which would have been half that amount, half the $12.8 million amount. The Nets cannot do that because he was injured with the Warriors. So they're just going to have to, take him in and, they could decide if they want to play out the season with him. I doubt he's going to agree to any buyout, but they can keep his non-bird rights for a sign and trade. That's really like as far as what utility the contract has left. They can try to trade him again this year, or maybe they just let him expire and maybe use him for a sign and trade later. And the Nets didn't take on any long-term money. They swap an expiring salary for another expiring salary, and their cap space projection stays the same for the most part. They can still have up to $50 million in cap space for next offseason, and that factors in their ability to re-sign Cam Thomas, who will be a restricted free agent. And I would expect that I don't think they're going to have that much cap space. Over the past few years, or been a lot of rebuilding teams with max level cap space, and they haven't really used it all or used it in the traditional sense of signing free agents. They've been using it more so in trades, and ideally they're going to want to use their cap space to take on bad money with incentives attached. So if they do make some more trades, such as moving on from some of their veterans like Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, I do think that there's a good chance they are going to bring back some long-term money. And one of the better ways to bottom out is by getting off one of your best playmakers. So I think getting off Dennis Schroder will probably do a good deal of help for them to climb the reverse standings. So if we look at the upcoming 2025 draft, the Nets are expected to have 4 first-round picks, 3 of them in the mid to late the first round. Maybe they decide to trade one of them later, try to roll them over for a future first-round pick in a future season. But when looking at their own, currently they are projected with the they currently have the 9th worst record. And just looking at the teams above them, I would guess that they are going to raise their floor to at least having the 7th worst record. The Pistons are clearly trying, and I think the Sixers will start to punch above their weight pretty soon. So if anything, their good start maybe keeps their floor a little higher than they wanted it to be. But overall, when you look at this trade and probably the other subsequent moves are going to be, they're in a pretty fine spot to get much higher. I mean, they're only about 3 games behind the teams that are in the 4 through 6 seeding. So I think it was a good time to do this now, and they should be able to be in a pretty fine spot heading into the actual draft lottery.